Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. I am Alice, aka Chewing Gum Freak, and today we are talking about the GRE Analyze and Argument Essay. Now, if you don't know, I am offering some free meetings one-on-one to help assuage some of your worries and fears about GRE or anything related to that. So I will put the link to sign up for something like that in the pinned comment down below. If you're watching in the future, the pinned comment will also let you know if I'm still offering this free service. Come to me with questions about anything about studying, study plans, looking at essays, looking at the quant section, looking at verbal, anything goes, and I'm just here to help you out. So definitely look forward to seeing some of you. Getting into the essay today, this was submitted to me by someone over on Reddit. If you'd like to submit something to me, get in touch with me on Reddit, on Twitter, on Twitch, or even just send me an email. I will be more than happy to go in depth on some feedback for your essays. For this one, we'll go ahead and read the question. So the following appeared in a summary of a study on headaches suffered by the residents of Mentia. Salicylates are members of the same chemical family as aspirin, a medicine used to treat headaches. So before we get into anything, I want to break down the question here. This first sentence already tells you that there's probably going to be some sort of link made between aspirin, aka treating headaches, and this chemical or whatever it is called salicylates. So that already primes you to what the argument is going to be. Now, the second sentence, although many foods are naturally rich in salicylates, for the past several decades, food processing companies have also been adding salicylates to foods as preservatives. So here, it's really just giving you a fact. It's not making an argument, but it is kind of setting up the rest of the argument. Now, you want to take note that there is nothing about where all this information is coming from. That's usually not a big deal, but it's definitely something you can mention. The next one says, this rise in the commercial use of salicylates has been found to correlate with a steady decline in the average number of headaches reported by participants in our 20-year study. So this is a very, very key sentence because it sets up exactly what the claim is going to be. And you have a key word here, which is correlate, which means that these two things, salicylates and the average number of headaches reported by participants, are correlated, which means the relationship with them move together. As one increases, the other increases. As one decreases, the other decreases. Now, before we even continue to read here, we can already know one of our arguments is going to be this thing called correlation doesn't equal causation. And what that means is basically that just because two things are moving in concert with each other doesn't mean that one of them causes the other thing. This is a very, very key argument in maybe half of the analyze and argument essay questions, and it's something that you definitely want to keep in mind. So here, the fact that they even use the word correlate or that they move with means that we need to look out for that. Now, the next sentence says, recently, food processing companies have found that salicylates can also be used as flavor additives for foods. So this is new information. With this new use for salicylates, we can expect a continued steady decline in the number of headaches suffered by the average citizen of Mentia. So this gives you the definitive claim that the author is writing here, which is that now we have a new use for salicylates. People are going to be taking in more salicylates, and that is going to lead to a decrease in the number of headaches that we see. Hopefully, breaking down the question here, you can already see that there are a lot of logical mistakes, and we definitely want to break down each of them. Now remember, you don't have to talk about every single small point because, again, this is a timed essay, but you do want to point out a lot of the key arguments that need more proof. And the whole idea here is that you want to point out instances where the logic is not necessarily completely wrong, but that it could be wrong. And the only thing we need to know here is where we need more information in order to believe the author. So again, we are not trying to prove somebody wrong. We're instead trying to say, look, this is a very interesting claim here, but we don't have enough information to believe everything you say. So that's the mentality that you should have when you're looking at analyze and argument essays. Typically, the question itself is not super important, but we will look it over, write a response in which you examine the stated and or unstated assumptions of the argument. And here the key is those unstated assumptions, because usually that is where you're going to get the meat of your logical fallacies. Be sure to explain how the argument depends on these assumptions and what the implications are for the argument if the assumptions prove unwarranted. So essentially, if these assumptions are unwarranted, then what can we say about the argument that's been made? So with that in mind, let's look at the actual essay. All right, the introduction paragraph says, in the summary of a study on headaches suffered by the residents of Mentia, the author states that the steady decrease of headaches suffered by the average citizen of Mentia will continue. Good. The author has come to this conclusion based on the correlation between mentioned drop with the increasing use of salicylates, as well as food processing companies' recent invention. The evidence suggests that these substances can be added to food as an addictive saver. However, before this conclusion can be drawn, two particular assumptions made in the paper ought to be looked at. Overall, I think this is a strong introduction for a few reasons. The first is that in this first sentence, the writer here talks about exactly what the claim is. So you want to make sure that you understand what's being argued in the original paragraph. And here, the first sentence outlines that completely and very well. The second sentence is also written overall quite well. It is the main reason that the original author has come to this conclusion. This word invention here is a little bit awkward because it's not an invention that the food processing companies came up with. It's more of a discovery or a finding that salicylates can also be used for flavoring. And along with that, here where it's talking about salicylates being added to food, this wording of an addictive savor, it makes sense, but it sounds a bit awkward because there is no mention, first of all, that salicylates are addictive at all. You don't want to introduce unnecessary information or unfounded information because there's no way to back that up yourself. You really want to stay away from claims like that. The last thing I will point out is here, the last sentence of the introduction is pretty good, saying that two assumptions are questionable. I personally prefer to outline exactly what these assumptions are so that you don't have your reader guessing at what you're going to be talking about. The mark of a good essay is that you tell people what you're going to say, you say it, and then you remind them what you told them. It's this idea of repeating yourself 3 times so that by the end, your reader has no doubt exactly what your point is. So here, instead of just saying 2 particular assumptions, I would say the assumptions that X and Y that are made in the paper ought to be looked at. So now let's look at the first point that our test taker says. Firstly, the author supposes that the newfound characteristics of salicylates will ensure something, therefore the overall diminish of headaches remains a trend. I think reading this, we can all understand sort of the meaning of what our test taker is trying to say, but the way that it's worded is very awkward. First of all, we never want to use this word something or thing or stuff because those are so vague, we have no idea what you're referring to. You never want to let the reader make assumptions because they may make the wrong assumptions. And so it's much better to say exactly what it is that this newfound characteristic will ensure. After reading the rest of the paragraph, I know that the author here is basically making the case that the newfound characteristic of salicylates being a flavoring will lead to a continuing decrease in the number of headaches. You really want to make that clear and never use words like something, thing, stuff, nothing that is vague. Now let's continue. Yet, no data is supporting this thought process indicated in the summary. That's correct. Maybe, because of this feature, companies will try to take advantage of the customers. In other words, there would be another increase in the number of salicylates pumped into food to ensure higher income. If these chemicals reduce headaches, this would decrease the statistics, but will it? The summary mentioned that these substances are already used in foods as preservatives, thereby it may not be in producers' interest to make the levels higher. Furthermore, there is a possibility that because of it, the salicylates use will become limited. The government can try to prevent companies from harming their customers, so if the above is true, the number of headaches in Mentia could rise. If either of these scenarios has merits, then the conclusion drawn in the original argument is significantly debilitated. Here, I can see a good attempt by our test taker to argue essentially that the finding about salicylates is going to have some sort of effect on the number of salicylates in food. I think this is definitely something that the author of the argument is trying to make as well. But our test taker makes a huge mistake, which is that our test taker focuses too much on what the possible explanations or the possible results are, rather than the fact that there are possible results and we have no idea what these possible results are. What I mean by that is if we take a look here, we have how many sentences? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 sentences and probably 3/4 or 2/3 of the paragraph talking about things that are totally not mentioned in the original argument. All of this information is what I call excessive speculation. So instead of attacking the fact that the logic is off, our test taker here is focusing on the details. What are the possible things that could happen as a result of this finding about salicylates? In essence, the idea of this paragraph is really good. The fact that the author assumes that this new finding about salicylates is going to increase our consumption of salicylates and lead to a diminish in headaches. But the fact is that we have no idea if this is going to be true or not. We have no evidence, and our test taker needs to attack the fact that there's no evidence rather than all the possibilities that could come from that. So moving on to the next paragraph. Secondly, the summary argues that the correlation between some two factors is a piece of relevant evidence based on what it is assumed that one causes another. It is not true. There might be some so-called third cause factor. It could be the real cause for both of them. Okay, so before we read on, we can tell by these two sentences that this paragraph is about correlation and causation. The correct name of this is correlation does not equal causation. That is usually how it's spoken about in science classrooms, for example. And if we ignore the fact that the wording here is a little bit awkward, our test taker makes a good argument because, like I mentioned when we were reading the question itself, correlation and causation are very often confused, and a lot of times you can't assume that just because two things are correlated that they actually cause each other. So here our test taker says it's possible that there could be a third cause factor. I think she means a third factor that causes both of them, but that's not the only possibility here. If we say that salicylate consumption correlates with a decrease in headaches, how do we know it's not a decrease in headaches that's allowing people to consume more salicylates? Or it could be what's written here, which is that there's a third factor that causes both. All of these are possible, so you really don't want to specify all of these details or speculate again about what the actual true relationship is. It's more about the fact that this relationship exists than about what the relationship is, just like the previous paragraph. I also won't read all of the examples that our test taker has here because, as you can see again, if I highlight this, all of this is again, excessive speculation about what the true relationship between salicylate consumption and headaches are, but all of those details are totally irrelevant here. If I was writing this paper, I would completely delete this or shrink it so that one sentence talks about what these third cause factors could be. So instead of saying there might be a so-called third cause factor that causes both of them, I would say there could be a third factor that causes both of them, such as X and Y. And that would be the end of everything that I'm going to say about the actual details about what those factors are. Instead, I want to focus here on the fact that correlation does not equal causation. What I want to do instead is talk about what information I would need in order to be secure in the knowledge that salicylates would lead to fewer headaches, for example. And in addition, what exactly this correlation is or what the relationship is actually not super clear here. Now, for most arguments, this isn't going to be a huge issue because the relationship in question is going to be pretty clear. However, in this argument, we don't know if the relationship is between salicylate consumption and headaches, or if it's between the finding that salicylates can be used for flavoring and that people are going to be more exposed to it. So these are two assumptions that are being discussed in the argument that are not specifically addressed or explained in either one of these paragraphs. You really want to make sure that you don't spend all of your time talking about all of these possibilities and these details that are completely irrelevant. And you want to instead point out what exactly the relationship that's being talked about here is and why that relationship is not strong. And then you want to talk about what information would let you be confident in believing what the argument is saying. Now we just have the conclusion left. Concluding, the argument as it stands now is considerably flawed due to its reliance on several unwarranted assumptions. Good. If the author could provide proof, possibly a bunch of research studies, that the above is not the cases, then the stated conclusion may be re-evaluated. For now, these circumstances imply that it could be faulty. So here, the second sentence, if the author could provide proof, possibly a bunch of research studies. Number one, I would not say a bunch of, I would say many or a variety of, to sound a little bit more professional. That the above is not the case, then the stated conclusion may be re-evaluated. I think that's fair. Like I mentioned before, I do think the essay here would benefit from the proof being discussed in each of the above paragraphs so that you understand what information is needed for each argument that you're making to make sure that the relationship makes sense. Here, to do it this way is okay as well. The only thing I would also point out is that here, the conclusion doesn't talk about what the unwarranted assumptions are. As I mentioned before, you should tell people what you're going to say, you should say it, and then you should summarize what you said for the reader so they know exactly what you mean and what you want to emphasize. The reasoning behind this argument being faulty is not being reiterated, which takes away from a little bit of extra strength that this conclusion could have. As it stands now, it's really not a conclusion that is necessary. So if you're going to write a conclusion, you want to make sure that it summarizes what you have said throughout the entire essay, so it's clear that there was an actual reason to include it. Overall, I would say this essay is probably between a 3 and a 4. I think the test taker has a pretty basic understanding of the flaws in the argument and develops their reasoning pretty well, but it is not super clear. There are a lot of confusing wording, a lot of excessive speculation, a bit of rambling, and there are a few typos here that don't necessarily detract from the meaning of the paper, but they do contribute as a whole to some of the errors. So I think overall, the main advice that I had for this test taker is to focus on the question itself. So every single sentence wants to be referring back to something that's written or explicitly implied in the question itself, and that they are a lot more clear about what they mean and what they want to say. That's it. I hope that was helpful. If you want to access this paper, you can find a link to it in the description down below. Don't forget to make appointments with me if you want somebody to talk to and guide you through whatever step of the preparation process you are at right now. Follow me on social media. I also stream on Twitch a little bit. I would hope to see you there. Like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.